Ben Shapiro is wrong about gun control. One argument that you'll hear him make on this subject is that the core purpose of owning guns in this country is to protect against government tyranny.
Fundamentally, the right believes that the basis for the Second Amendment, and they believe in the Second Amendment, the basis for the Second Amendment is not really about self-defense and it's not about hunting. It is about resistance to government tyranny. That's what the founders said.
Now, back when this country was founded, things were on a much more even playing field back then, where the government soldiers, they had their really shitty-ass rifles. Maybe, they had a sword with them, perhaps a couple of cannons. And really, for the most part, that's what they were limited to in terms of the weaponry. And the guns they were using, they could fire one round at a time. It was like, ready, aim, fire. It was like this big event to fire one fucking bullet. They could fire 3 to 4 rounds per minute. And so, at that time period, yes, the general populace, or a well-regulated militia, armed with these same sort of weapons, they definitely would have been much more capable of resisting government soldiers, resisting the military, and resisting the sort of government tyranny that people talk about. But, nowadays, citizen weaponry versus the U.S. military, there's such a massive, severe imbalance between the two that the idea of posing any sort of effective resistance is just a complete fucking fantasy. Like, imagine nowadays there's some sort of militia group, and they're holed up in some sort of warehouse, taking up a defensive position. They have their semi-automatic rifles, they have their pistols, and, they're well-trained. They've been out on their farm or wherever the fuck they live. They've been shooting at targets, running drills, and doing all sorts of practice, and, well-trained, and they're ready to defend America against tyranny. And they're set up, posted up in the windows with their guns and shit. Dude, the military could just drop a fucking Predator missile on that warehouse and just kill them all and just reduce it to fucking rubble. Like, they wouldn't even need to send soldiers for some sort of on-the-ground fight where it's like an evenly matched firefight between the militia and the military. Dude, they could just drop a fucking airstrike on the building. They could drop 20 airstrikes on the buildings. It's just like, there's no match between the two forces. And, it's kind of ironic because it's like, maybe if Republicans didn't support such a ridiculously high military budget, they might have some sort of argument here. But given how well equipped our military is in terms of all the advanced weaponry and hardware and fighter jets and missiles and the 1,600 types of different fucking bombs they can drop on your head, this idea that some average Joes in their fucking like camo uniforms with their semi-automatic weapons, the idea that they would pose any sort of effective resistance, it's just a complete fantasy. Republicans, sometimes they'll point to Vietnam as, proof that an outmatched population can resist a superior army. And I look at that and I'm just like, what? So is Ben Shapiro going to go live underground in the jungle in a series of intricate tunnels, dodging napalm airstrikes for 4 years and then emerging with his 9mm pistol to save America? I'm just like, dude, get the fuck out of here. These people are living in just a complete fantasy land. And regarding Vietnam specifically, they weren't exclusively using just the kinds of weapons that are available to U.S. citizens. It wasn't just like, single fire fucking pistols and assault rifles. The North Vietnamese, they were supplied by the Soviet Union, by the Chinese governments. They had, anti-aircraft rocket launchers. They had fully automatic machine guns. Not exactly comparable to the type of weapons that are available to citizens in the U.S. today. Ben Shapiro, in a David Pakman interview, he argued, our population, they actually could pose an effective resistance against the U.S. military.
And if you only give them rifles and the tanks roll out, the rifles are useless.
True. It's just not true. I mean, I've spoken to veterans at the War College who have done studies of what would happen in case of an armed insurrection in the United States. If the American population is armed with semi-automatic rifles, the Army cannot handle them. Now, God forbid it should ever come to that point, obviously, okay. And I don't think we're near that point now. But the argument that you need tanks in order to resist tyranny is not true. And obviously the menace to public safety provided by tanks is significantly higher than the menace provided by a semi-automatic rifle, which, as you said, is not really the main threat in gun violence anyway.
Now, I wasn't able to find any such studies that actually looked into this question. I tried to research it and find out, what are these studies that say such a thing. I wasn't able to find any. But if you just consider the scenario that he's envisioning here, what he says there, he says, quote, the case of an armed insurrection in the United States. Quote, if the American population is armed with semi-automatic rifles. What he seems to be talking about here is the country as a whole taking up arms. Hundreds of millions of people picking up an AR-15 and getting ready to blast some fools. But I look at that and I'm just like, under what scenario is this even conceivable? Like, what events or government actions would be so egregious and so universally accepted as tyrannical that the whole fucking population, or at least everyone of fighting age, would pick up a rifle or grab some pistols and be ready to go to war with our government to protect America? Because it's like, we're not living under some fucking Middle East dictatorship, We live in a representative democracy. It's not a perfect one. There's definitely corruption and problems and definitely many things that are wrong with it. But at the end of the day, it's a representative democracy where you can go into you go to the voting booth and, you cast your vote and you pick the person that you want to elect. And it's not like we just have this one fucking tyrant who just, rules with an iron fist, so to speak. And we also have within our government, we have checks and balances that are there to protect against this sort of tyranny. Again, not necessarily perfect. Maybe you have like one administration, they have everyone who's like-minded, and sometimes they can appoint people who are sort of like lapdogs and yes men to a certain extent. So again, not perfect, but we have these checks and balances in place within our government to guard against these sort of nightmarish, tyrannical scenarios. So with that in mind, I look at what Shapiro's saying here, and I'm just like, what event in 21st century America, with our representative democracy and our checks and balances, would be so tyrannical that the entire population would be inspired to take up arms? I'm really not seeing the sort of scenario that would actually trigger such an event. And Ben Shapiro, in his Piers Morgan interview, he gave an example of the type of event that he worries about. Let's watch.
Which tyranny are you fearing yourself?
I fear the possibility of a tyranny rising in this country in the next 50 to 100 years. Let me tell you something, Piers. The fact that my grandparents and great-grandparents in Europe didn't fear that is why they are now ashes in Europe. So this kind of leftist revisionist history, where there's never any fear of democracy going usurpacious or tyrannical, is just that. It's fictitious.
Now, I definitely do sympathize with this because, this is the fucking Holocaust. It's like arguably the worst thing that's ever happened. And it's something that impacted Ben Shapiro and his family directly. So I don't want to downplay this or like minimize the severity of the event, and that's definitely not what I'm saying here. But what I would invite you to ask yourself is, how likely is it that in 21st century America we would see another Holocaust? Like a flat out legitimate genocide, deliberate extermination where you put people in fucking concentration camps and just systematically kill them. 21st century America, how likely does that strike you as? And I'm just like, what administration would this happen under? Would this happen under the Joe Biden administration, Ted Cruz administration? Would they campaign openly on this? During the debates, would they come out and say, my opponent does not support systematic genocide of people? It's just like the idea of presenting an idea like this to the public in modern society with our media and just all the advancements we've made as a society. It seems completely, flatly ridiculous to me. And I'm just like, even if there was some sort of president and an administration that was trying to push this through, under what circumstances would our representative democracy with our checks and balances be totally powerless and unable to resist this? I don't mean to sound naive or Pollyannish about how wonderful and perfect our government is, but we're talking about an actual Holocaust in 21st century America. It sounds like complete and total nonsense to me. What you have in the United States is, every year, roughly 40,000 real people are dying every single year from gun violence, largely attributable to our very loose gun laws. And this idea that we should continue to maintain the status quo and, not really implement any serious forms of gun control on the off chance that maybe there's another Holocaust in the US, it doesn't strike me as a very rational cost-benefit analysis there. You have like the extreme unlikelihood of the one hypothetical scenario versus the actual real events taking place and the actual real people who are dying in this country from gun violence. I don't see the trade-off there, and I don't see how the logic here supports the Shapiro viewpoint on this. Now, Ben Shapiro, he gives a couple additional examples of the sort of tyrannical events he worries about and uses as justification for his views on the Second Amendment in a David Pakman interview. Let's watch.
And the fact is that we have seen tyranny on American soil. I mean, we had 120,000 Japanese folks who were imprisoned during World War II. We had Jim Crow in the South for 100 years. We had slavery in this country for 80 years after the Declaration of Independence. So
now let's just stop and take a moment to consider what Ben Shapiro is arguing here. What he's saying is that an armed American population, it's an effective resistance against government tyranny. And then to support this viewpoint of his, he gives examples of government tyranny that have taken place in America with our heavily armed population. Just think about that for a moment. Like, don't you see the fucking problem here? If he's correct about this, that an armed American populace deters this sort of government tyranny, shouldn't he not be able to point to any examples? Doesn't this undermine the argument he's making? Where he's like, if you have the guns, the tyranny won't happen within our country. It seems like he has it completely fucking backwards on this. Maybe it's different because we're talking about subjugated minority groups within the country. We're talking about, Jewish people in Europe. We're talking about slaves within the United States. We're talking about Japanese American citizens. But, looking at those examples, it's like, if those are always the circumstances that lead to tyranny, isn't the core problem that the broader culture and the country as a whole supports the sort of subjugation of minority groups? Isn't that the fundamental problem here and not firearm policy? It just seems like the diagnosis of what causes this and allows these circumstances to be created is just totally wrong in the Shapiro analysis. Like with Japanese internment, for example, was the core problem there that there was an insufficient number of firearms among the Japanese American community? Like, I don't see how that's your takeaway from that historical experience and that event. Just not enough firearms. That's the lesson there. No, the core problem was that this anti-Japanese American sentiment ever arose in this country in the wake of Pearl Harbor. That's the fundamental lesson of those events. It's not a story about how more firearms were needed. Like, how is that the lesson that you take away from that? And let's accept what Shapiro is saying here. Let's play it out logically and just really think it through. Let's say Japanese Americans did violently resist internment with firearms. How do you think that would have turned out during World War II, just after Pearl Harbor? A bunch of Japanese, they take up guns and they start shooting it out with soldiers. We're talking about 100,000 Japanese Americans, roughly speaking, that were interned. Let's say half of them were of fighting age and a temperament, and they took up weapons and they resisted. Whatever your moral views of Japanese internment, whatever you think morally about how completely wrong and, despicable it was, violent resistance with firearms would have almost certainly led to a much worse outcome for all parties involved. There's a blog post I read that had a really good quote on this, where the writer said the following, quote, "I think most people would agree that it would have been an unmitigated tragedy if the Japanese had resisted internment. At that time in our nation's history, in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, it's hard to imagine the death and destruction that could have resulted from resistance. In many ways, an armed rebellion would have served to confirm in the minds of the architects of internment the need for their policy. To put it simply, if the Japanese had resisted, they would have been slaughtered," end quote. Now, in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, if you look at Japanese internment, just, number of deaths, amount of human suffering, just looking at it that way, taking up arms and violently resisting would have almost certainly been the much worse decision to make here. And then just strategically speaking, tactically speaking, in terms of how do you achieve your political and social justice goals? Even from that standpoint, it's also extremely foolish, because if they were violently resisting like this, it almost certainly would have triggered a backlash against this minority group. It would have been cited as proof of their dastardliness and how inferior they are. And people would have looked at it and been like, see, I told you, these filthy Japanese people need to be locked up and caged because they're subversives and they're dangerous to the country. And it ultimately would have actually been counterproductive for them to resist in this way. Jim Crow laws in the South, it's another example Ben Shapiro gives in that David Pakman interview. How did we ultimately do away with these racist laws in America? Did the black population take up arms? Did they violently engage in gunfights with the government, eventually forcing them to relent because of all the bloodshed that took place from black Americans fighting against the government? No, this was a non-violent resistance movement that turned the tide. Martin Luther King Jr., he did not encourage us to use firearms in the fight for racial justice. I have a dream that we pick up our guns and start fucking blasting fools. Let's go. Bleh. You know, like that. That is not the way that I recall that speech going. No, it was a nonviolent movement. The philosophy was turn the other cheek, nonviolent opposition. It's like, even though people are subjugating you and treating you like trash, meet that with compassion and an unwillingness to return the favor with that same sort of violence and despicable treatment. And that was the philosophy that helped to turn the tide. And again, how do we think things would have turned out if there was massive armed resistance? Where if the black community, they took up guns and started shooting it out in the streets with police and the government and military soldiers, how would that have ended up? Could it have triggered counterproductive backlash in this country, where some percentage of the populace would turn against the black community and say, "Look at this violence, it's horrible." Could it have set the struggle for racial justice back several decades? Maybe it could have even triggered a second civil war, where some percentage of the country in the more racist regions, they would have turned against them, and it could have been just flat out civil war. It's hard to say for sure because we're just kind of fucking like talking about this, but what's absolutely clear, I think, from this overall discussion is violent armed resistance in response to, subjugation of minority groups or tyranny or whatever you want to call it. Very often that would just be extremely ineffective strategically, and it would just be an inappropriate means of response that would be counterproductive, cause tons of needless harm for people. And I think for Ben Shapiro to just toss it out like some sort of, some blanket cure-all for government tyranny or wrongdoing, for many reasons, I think it's just very stupid, and it's just a very oversimplified position. Now, here's another absolutely massive, Godzilla-sized problem with this argument Ben Shapiro is making. He says, the purpose of owning firearms in this country is to protect against government tyranny. That's the basic position he's making here.
The basis for the Second Amendment is not really about self-defense, and it's not about hunting. It is about resistance to government tyranny. That's what the founders said.
The problem is, who's to say what tyranny is? What's the criteria that we're using? Where do we draw the line to where we say, at this point, we can say government actions have become sufficiently tyrannical that they justify taking up arms to violently resist? Who's to say that? What's the criteria? How are we going to go about making those sort of decisions? Because according to some in this country, our government is already doing many tyrannical things. Listen to libertarians, for example. They talk about taxation as tyranny. Taxation is theft. They talk about the moral outrage of the government stealing your money, sending men with guns to lock you up in a cage if you resist. And they just talk about how morally egregious this tyranny is. According to this Ben Shapiro argument here, shouldn't these people take up arms and violently resist the government? And if they did do this, on what moral grounds could Ben Shapiro oppose this? I mean, Ben Shapiro, he would have no moral argument here against far-right, libertarian whack jobs, taking up arms, and having gunfights in the streets with police and military. If we turned on the news and saw that, thousands of libertarians, they stormed the government building today and shot it out with police, and the National Guard is struggling to fight back against them. You turn on CNN and you see this shit. What argument would Shapiro be able to make against this? Because, in their eyes, the police and the military, they're just agents of this tyrannical government state. And all they would be doing, from their perspective, is just bravely resisting government tyranny in accordance with the Second Amendment. So Ben Shapiro couldn't oppose these actions on moral grounds. It's his exact same logic. All he could do is quibble with them about whether the government actions in question are sufficiently tyrannical to justify the sort of armed, violent resistance. And here we really see just the fundamental stupidity of this position, because it just opens the door to all kinds of violent resistance and gunfights and bloodshed with firearms against really any government policy that's deemed sufficiently tyrannical. Like the Bundy brothers, for example. Remember those right-wing whack jobs who they took over some government buildings with guns? And, in their view, They were doing exactly what Ben Shapiro is describing here. They were using their Second Amendment's rights to take up arms and resist government tyranny. Like, if you were to ask them if that's what they're doing, if you showed them a clip of Ben Shapiro making this argument about the Second Amendment, they'd be like, dude, 100%, that's exactly what we're doing here. This guy gets it. Even, a terrorist whack job like Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Oklahoma City federal building. Listen to him explain his actions. Go read up on why he did it and what was going on inside of his head to justify it, in his view. Ask him, why'd you do this? He said, I was merely resisting government tyranny. That's his perspective on what he was doing. Now, granted, he did use a fertilizer bomb instead of firearms, but, all he was doing, in his perspective, was just using the most effective tool that he could find to resist what he viewed as government tyranny. So this really just brings up a major problem with this argument here, because it's one thing to imagine valiantly resisting something just horribly evil like the Holocaust or something like that, but since there's no clear criteria of what is classed as government tyranny that requires people to take up arms, this argument, this viewpoint, this position, it just opens up the door to flat out domestic terrorism. Because if somebody's tyranny threshold is lower than Ben Shapiro's, then doesn't it logically follow that people, they're going to take up arms and violently resist the government for what are in actuality just completely ridiculous and completely trivial so-called tyrannical government overreaches? Because if you listen to enough right-wingers, there's practically nothing they won't describe as tyranny. Like, I've seen government laws around milk described as tyrannical. Milk. Like, you fucking pour it in a glass and you drink it. Tyranny. Government tyranny around dairy. And I'm just like, okay, so is Ben Shapiro willing to take up arms against governmental dairy policy? These people are saying it's tyranny. So, by his logic, should we be exercising our Second Amendment right to take up arms against this outrage surrounding milk? And if Ben Shapiro is not willing to do this, on what grounds is he going to oppose the people who would do this? Because they'd be making the exact same argument he's making here. So this argument, it really does open the door to all kinds of moronic and immoral nonsense. And if people actually take this argument seriously and act in accordance with it, it's actually very, very dangerous to society. Something else Ben Shapiro does is he makes all kinds of straw man arguments against his opponents on the subject of gun control. For example, talking about mass shootings in schools, he had the following to say.
He wrote to the teachers in that area. He said, come, I'll teach you conceal and carry. I'll give you a conceal and carry license. I'll teach you, train you how to carry a gun so that you can take them inside your classrooms. And I'll do this for free. Hundreds of teachers have responded. Listen to this.
I guess the idea is if a shooter were to walk into a classroom, you just don't know who in the school is carrying a gun.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great solution. I mean, you're trusting your safety to the teachers anyway every single day when you send your kids to school. And we're telling these teachers that it's better for them to jump in front of doors and block bullets with their body than to arm these same teachers so that they can actually defend the students. It makes zero sense.
Now, this has got to be the false dichotomy of the century. Either you support teachers pathetically blocking bullets with their body, or you support arming these teachers to effectively defend the students against these shooters. Which one is it going to be? I'm like, dude, how about fucking neither of these stupid options? How about neither of those two? Like, I know absolutely zero people who argue that the ideal solution to mass shootings is having teachers try to block doorways with their bullet-riddled corpses. Like, show me one person who has made that argument. It's got to be the dumbest fucking straw man I've ever heard. There are more than just these two extreme options here when it comes to going about reducing mass shootings and their severity. Like, how about we just make it more fucking difficult for people to obtain the guns that are used in these mass shootings in the first place? I mean, how's that for a fucking sensible third option here? Shapiro, sometimes he'll ask whenever people talk about assault weapon bans or, limitations on certain weapons in the wake of mass shootings, sometimes he'll come out and he'll say things like, why not just call for a total gun ban?
You can address them to Mark Kelly because he agrees with everything that I've been saying because he feels the same way as does his wife. They're gun owners. They both respect the Second Amendment of the Constitution. They don't want to take away anybody's right to defend themselves with guns.
They want to take away certain types of guns, obviously.
They want to take away assault weapons, which are capable with magazines like we saw at Aurora and Sandy Hook of unleashing a ridiculous amount of bullets.
Well, this is a question I wanted to ask you, Piers, because I've seen you talk about assault weapons a lot, and I've seen Mark Kelly talk about assault weapons. The vast majority of murders in this country that are committed with guns are not committed with assault weapons, they're committed with handguns.
Okay,
so are you willing to ban handguns in this country across the country?
No, that's not what I'm asking for.
Why not?
Let me ask you...
Don't you care about the kids who are being killed in Chicago as much as the kids in Sandy Hook?
Yes, I do.
Then why don't you care about banning the handguns in Chicago?
You know that awkward moment when you think you're being clever, but you actually just make a good point? No, I mean, it's funny that on the one hand, conservatives, like, they try to downplay the severity of gun violence in this country. Where, you know, you show them all the stats and stuff, and they really just try to minimize it and talk about, like, how it's not as bad as you make it out to be. And there's a lot of good that comes from guns as well and so forth, and they really just try to downplay it. And then you focus on assault rifles specifically, like, you know, floating the idea of perhaps we should ban these assault weapons, and they're like, assault rifles? You're talking about banning assault rifles? Dude, what about this ocean of violence over here from all the handguns in this country? I mean, it's just fucking dead people everywhere from handguns. I'm just like, it's not exactly the most compelling pro-gun argument I've ever heard, you know? I mean, as far as pro-gun arguments go, I've definitely heard better. And this is not the one that I would lead with if I was them. Now, I mean, Shapiro, he's not wrong when he says, you know, that a flat-out gun ban, politically, it would just be very difficult to enact in this country because, you know, there are so many passionate amosexuals that live in the United States that it would be super hard to just flat-out say, like, no more guns, we're going to come seize them and take your guns away. I mean, that would probably lead to just tons of violence in this country. And it just politically, in the United States, I just think it's very... non-feasible. So I think he's right about that. But it also doesn't mean that we just throw our fucking arms up and do nothing about the problem. Like many Republicans, when I talk to and debate the subject with them, they frame it as this fucking all or nothing scenario, where it's like, if you can't perfectly eliminate every conceivable form of gun death from perfect gun control, then, you know, that somehow invalidates the pro-gun control position, and you lose. And therefore, there's no point in any of this. And it's just a total bullshit framing, because it's not about utopian harm elimination to 100% degree of perfection, where it's like, there's never another gun death, and, you know, there are fucking, like, harps playing, and there are, like, rainbows in the background and stuff. It's, you know, it's not about just this sort of utopian fucking perfect state. It's just about doing as much as we can to minimize the harm that comes from gun violence. And, you know, that can mean tougher regulations in terms of restrictions on the clip size of a weapon, so you don't have these fucking like 30, 100 you know, round magazines that are often used in mass shootings. It can mean regulations on weapon caliber, so that it's like you can still have a gun to defend yourself, but it's way less lethal because you're not fucking shooting these big ass slugs into people that are way more deadly statistically. It can mean mental health screenings. It can mean training requirements as a prerequisite to gun ownership, so that people are more responsible with how they handle and store the weapon, and you know, all of these types of regulations, they would help to reduce the number of gun deaths. I mean, it might not perfectly eliminate them all, but what if we could cut the number of gun deaths in half in this country? What if we could drop it to like 20% of what it's at now, or drop it to 10%? Isn't that better than just doing nothing and just saying, you know, we can't perfectly solve the problem, so it's fruitless, or you can't totally ban and eliminate guns, so therefore just why even fucking bother? Like, shouldn't we at least try to do as much as we can instead of just making these sort of defeatist arguments? That's kind of how I look at that. When you actually press Ben Shapiro on specific forms of gun control, you find out that he you know, a large number of the laws that people on the left are advocating, he actually also supports them as well.
Asking you, should anything happen with guns? Should there be more guns, less guns? What do we do about the guns specifically?
You know, more guns in the hands of people who are responsible and less guns in the hands of people who are irresponsible. So that's why I said on the show, I'm in favor of background checks. I have no problem with background checks. And I, you know, generally speaking, I don't have a problem with the idea that you have to be trained to own a gun so that you actually know what you're doing with it. These are all things that I don't see as significantly burdensome to obtaining a gun.
So just to clarify your position then, the answer to Sandy Hook, as it was to Aurora, as it was to Gabrielle Giffords, as it was to Columbine, Virginia Tech, is you do nothing. Is that your position?
And that's not my position.
What is your position?
My position is that we have to calibrate laws that are designed to get guns out of the hands of bad people and keep guns in the hands of good people who want to buy them. This idea of more guns versus less guns.
How do you do that?
Well, I think one of the ways that you do that is by better screening for mental illness. I think that you do better background checks.
So
only assault rifles.
Which guns would you remove?
I think the ones that have largely been removed from the market, fully automatic weapons, would be a good start.
Would you want every American to have an AR-15?
No, not every American.
Who would you stop?
I would stop anyone with a criminal background. I would stop anybody with a history of mental illness. And I would stop, and I would ask, and not ask, I would require that people who have somebody who has a criminal background or a history of mental illness in the household keep that gun locked up and safe.
What about the background checks? 40% of all gun sales in America now, gun trades, are not covered by background checks.
I believe in background checks.
For everybody?
For everybody.
So there should be a database, a national register?
If it's not public. I don't like what happened with the Journal News putting out gun permits, which allows criminals to target particular homes.
So Ben Shapiro, he positions himself as this, this big-time pro-gun guy, this big Second Amendment guy. But then when you pin him down on specific forms of gun control, very often he's totally on board. They're like, what about this form of gun control, Mr. Shapiro? And he's like, yeah, totally. What about this one? He's like, fine by me. So, I look at that and I'm just like, if we agree that number one, there's a major gun violence problem in the United States, and then number two, we also agree that these regulations could help to reduce this problem, why does he spend so much time on the subject trying to own the libs and destroy them and annihilate them with facts and logics, when instead we could just work together to enact these sort of gun regulations and work towards these shared goals? That's the question that I have for him. And maybe the answer is because this would just not be popular among his right-wing fan base. Like, all those gun control regulations that he supports there, mental health screenings, training requirements, restrictions on this or that type of weapon, whatever it may be. If I were just to list all of these off to you and ask you, guess the person who supports these gun regulations, you would guess maybe it was Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks. Maybe it was Kyle Kulinski ranting about gun violence. Perhaps it was Beto O'Rourke at one of his gun control rallies. You would not have guessed Ben Shapiro was the person who was supporting this. Like, if he showed up at a CPAC events and just gave a speech advocating all these different types of gun control, he would get booed off the fucking stage. So I think one possible reason why Shapiro takes the own the libs approach when it comes to gun laws in this country is just he doesn't want to alienate Republicans who comprise his fan base. And kind of to support this a little bit, Piers Morgan in the interview that he did with Shapiro, he asked him a question, a very, very straightforward, very, very clear question about the NRA. And Ben Shapiro just completely dodges the question.
When the NRA came out today after their meeting with the White House and just said we're just not prepared to entertain effectively any kind of new gun restrictions. What do you think of that?
What's astonishing to me is the left's attack on the NRA, because the NRA they don't receive a dime of public dollars. They're an interest group. I don't see, it's funny, the left, they like to talk also about violent video games, for example.
Now, why would he dodge such a straightforward question like this, is my question to you. Is it because he doesn't want the flack? The headlines saying Ben Shapiro, he slams the NRA. Ben Shapiro criticizes the NRA in the wake of their toothless response to mass shootings in this country. I can't say for sure. I'm not a fucking mind reader. It's just one clip from one interview. But, I definitely think that if we all agree that these gun regulations are a good idea, why not make that the focus? Why not make that the priority instead of owning the libs and destroying them on the Second Amendment and gun laws? That's kind of my question. And regarding his support for all these gun control regulations that he just listed off, why not return to the earlier argument he made, where Ben Shapiro said the core purpose of the Second Amendment, it's to resist government tyranny. Fundamentally, that's what it's for. Couldn't we just flip his arguments around and say, how dare you ban automatic weapons, Mr. Shapiro? Who are you to tell me I can't have a fully automatic machine gun? Do such weapons not make us more effective resistors against government tyranny? If that's the core purpose of the Second Amendment, why not prioritize that function, being able to maximally resist this government tyranny? While we're at it, what about tanks and rocket launchers? The government has these fucking things. If we're going to combat government tyranny, we might as well combat it to the max. If they have tanks, why should we not have tanks? If they have Humvees with 50 caliber fucking machine guns, why should we not have them as well to resist their tyrannical efforts? Come on, Anton, you're just being silly here. What, by applying Republican logic? I agree. It's pretty fucking silly, but I'm just using their logic here. And this is not a fucking straw man or anything. I mean, many Republicans do argue this about the Second Amendment, about weapons, ownership rights. I've had people argue that we should be able to own tanks, rocket launchers, fully automatic guns, sometimes even nuclear fucking weapons. Like there was some crackpot Republican whack job who, Right Wing Watch, they tweeted out a clip of his advocating that, yes, according to this logic, citizens should be able to own and possess nuclear weapons. Just complete and total fucking lunacy. But it logically follows from the argument that they're making.
So in the same way, I don't want to see my neighbor stockpile nuclear bombs. Yeah, I don't want to see it, but I don't care if he has one because he should have the same rights. But you're saying, well, I don't think private citizens should have nuclear weapons. But if you've been trained with responsibility and morality and the concept of when and where you use them, the Founding Fathers are trained extensively in the concept of defensive warfare. You don't start anything. Now, if somebody else starts it, you can take it on, but you don't start it. I don't care if my neighbor has a nuclear weapon as long as he has that defensive concept that he will never use that unless it's being used against him.
I mean, these people are serious about resisting tyranny. Ben Shapiro with his pussy-ass, lukewarm, semi-automatic rifle resisting of tyranny. Dude, that's fucking weak sauce, bro. These people are talking about fucking tanks and nuclear weapons, and your bitch ass is stuck over here with your 9mm pistol. I'm just like, dude, Ben Shapiro, you need to step your fucking tyrannical resistance game up. By conceding that, yes, there is some acceptable degree of gun regulation, it really is just a matter of where do we draw the line here. Because, if we ban automatic weapons, like Ben Shapiro supports, it's not totally outlandish to say maybe we should also ban X, Y, and Z as well. Different types of weapons, perhaps. Maybe we could limit weapon calibers, weapon accessories or modifications like bump stocks that convert them to functionally fully automatic. I feel like it's all fair game from there once you grant that, yeah, I mean, fully automatic weapons, okay, that's, a menace to society enough that we can ban that. It's like once you open the fucking door to that, let's not position it like these other forms of gun control are outlandish or unreasonable, because it really is just a matter of where do we draw the line. Ben Shapiro, when talking about gun control, he'll sometimes make a distinction between responsible and irresponsible gun owners.
Asking you, should anything happen with guns? Should there be more guns, less guns? What do we do about the guns specifically?
More guns in the hands of people who are responsible and less guns in the hands of people who are irresponsible. So that's why I said on the show, I'm in favor of background checks. I have no problem with background checks. And
now, it sounds nice in theory to make this distinction, but, Republican arguments like this, they can very often turn into what's called the no true Scotsman fallacy. Like, sometimes you'll point out statistics on gun violence or gun death within the United States, and Republicans will respond by saying, aha, but those are criminals that you're talking about. Those are irresponsible gun owners that you're pointing to. What I support are responsible gun owners, not these irresponsible criminal individuals here. And I'm hoping that you can see the problem with this line of argument, because by definition, before doing anything criminal or irresponsible with their firearms, by definition, everyone starts out in this responsible gun owner group here. At least, using the criteria of like how we can observe their actions and label them from what we can just outwardly see from what they've done with their gun. So anytime somebody who starts out in this responsible group, anytime they do something criminal or irresponsible with their gun, like, maybe they get blacked out drunk and shoot somebody. Maybe in a moment of impulsive rage, they kill somebody. Maybe a fist fight, escalates to where he kills a person without justification. Maybe you could just go on and on with all these different scenarios here. Leaves the gun out on the table by accident, and, somebody kills somebody with it. Anytime that a person in the responsible group does one of these actions, by definition, they move into the irresponsible category. They move into the criminal category. So, like, if you point to any of these events that we just talked about and say, like, look, this is proof that we need stronger gun control laws in this country. Republicans, they can just say, aha, but that's a criminal. That's an irresponsible person. I'm talking about the responsible individuals here. And it really puts them in this sort of can't lose position where their position just cannot be falsified. Because no matter what people do with their guns, they can just switch the labels based on what's convenient. You know, it's just like the no true Scotsman fallacy, where you're like, no true Scotsman would ever do such a thing. So therefore, this person, they are no true Scotsman. It's like, heads I win, tails you lose. If they don't go out and fucking shoot up a school with their gun, then it's a responsible gun owner. But if he fucking snaps suddenly, for whatever fucking reason, and goes and shoots some people up, he moves into this category, and it puts him in this impossible to lose position. And it's really just something to watch for on that. Obviously, you know, certain people are more or less responsible with their guns in terms of like how they store it, how they use it. You know, like some people, they go out and shoot their guns, they get drunk and they shoot some fucking targets or whatever. They leave it out on the table where their kid can access it and shit like that. So I'm not saying there's no actual distinction. And it also is the case that, you know, certain regulations could help make people more responsible, where like if there was required training to be able to use a gun and stuff like that, yes, that would help to make sure that people are acting more responsibly. It's something to watch out for when they switch the labels on that, because this little dance that they do, it's really used by a lot of Republicans to just minimize the gun violence problem within the United States. Republicans, they often make really terrible analogies on gun control. Like Ben Shapiro, for example, in a recent tweet of his, he compared automobiles to firearms. There was an event where there was an intentional mass killing with an SUV. This guy, he plowed an SUV into a crowd, ended up killing, I think it was like 5 people, injuring several dozen people, and it was done so intentionally based upon the evidence that I read. And Ben Shapiro, he tweeted in response to this, "These SUVs are out of control." Obviously trying to make some sort of clever point about like gun control and people pointing to the tool or the problem here. And dude, my response to this is like, there were over 400 mass shootings this year with firearms. How many intentional mass killings were there with cars the same year? It definitely wasn't fucking 400. You know, Republicans, they make this analogy constantly. And I'm just like, really comparing automobiles to guns? Comparing cars to fucking guns? Like, let me ask you a question on this. When was the last time you drove yourself to the grocery store inside of a gun? It's a fucking stupid, absurd question because the comparison is absurd. Republicans, sometimes they don't look at intentional mass killings, but they'll just look broadly at all the car crash deaths within the United States. And they'll say like, this many people died in car crashes. Should we therefore also ban cars according to your liberal logic on gun control? And I'm just like, dude, an entire team of scientists working around the clock in a laboratory could not come up with a dumber fucking analogy if they tried to. It's so fucking stupid to make this comparison. It's called a car accident when somebody dies in a fucking automobile crash. It's not a gun accident when you shoot and kill somebody with your gun. That's the express purpose that the tool was created for. Like, your gun is working correctly when you fucking shoot and kill somebody with it. You can't say the same about car crashes, where it's like, yes, he fucking plowed into a brick wall and died. This vehicle is working perfectly. Dude, it's the fucking opposite of that. They have like safety tests with airbags and shit, and they have the little crash test dummies. They make every effort to minimize the number of deaths and make sure as few people are dying as possible. That's not exactly how it fucking works in the gun industry. The goal is to fucking shoot the guy's head off. The goal is to make the biggest fucking hole and cause the most damage and carnage. You know, the primary purpose of a car, it's transportation. It's not massive trauma and death. So I'm just like, can we please just stop with the stupid fucking analogies before you give us all brain damage? Ben Shapiro, he'll sometimes present statistics on gun control to support his position, and a lot of these are actually very misleading.
The fact is that the number of guns in the United States has gone up as the murder rate has gone down. Per capita, there are now 1.45 guns per American in the United States. There were less than 1 gun per American in the United States in 1993, and the murder rate has declined markedly since that time. So the idea that more guns equals more crime or more guns invariably equals more mass shooting, the evidence is really weak on this stuff.
Now, this is a classic example of just using a really bad, misleading metric purely because it supports your case versus some of the alternative metrics and numbers that you could use. Like number of guns in country, that is not a fucking good metric to use. because the number of guns owned by any one individual can massively vary. You can have anywhere from 0 guns, one person, they have no guns at all. You can have some fucking redneck who lives in the woods, he has 1,000 guns in some sort of shack. And it's not a good metric to analyze the dangers associated with gun ownership. Because it's like, the risks of owning a gun, they don't scale proportionally to the number of guns that you have. Like, if a person owns 300 guns, he's not going to walk around town with 300 fucking guns in his hands. You know? It's not like there's a 300x risk of him using any one gun, where it's like he's simultaneously carrying all of them, and it's like there's a 300-fold risk that any one gun will be used to shoot somebody. It just doesn't fucking work that way. And number of guns as a metric, this could also include guns that are just sitting in a fucking warehouse somewhere collecting dust, guns that are in some sort of crate that you have to open with the fucking crowbar before you can actually take it out and use it. It can include thousands of guns that are just inaccessible to people and just not in a position to be utilized in a sort of gun violence scenario. And a much better metric to use when talking about gun violence and the risks associated is the percent of households or people that actually own a gun. This is a much better indicator of how the risks actually correlate with an individual owning the gun versus just the total fucking number of guns somewhere within the massive land called the United States. Shapiro on Twitter, he shared a graph that compares the number of privately owned guns within the United States against the gun homicide rate. And, you know, there appears to be no correlation from this graph, and perhaps even arguably an inverse correlation. And a lot of Republicans, they point to this graph and they're like, aha, liberalism debunked, gun control refuted. You say more guns make us less safe and cause more death? Well, you know, the facts are actually the opposite. But the interesting thing about this graph is if instead of using the shitty metric number of guns and you instead add household gun ownership rate, it actually tracks very similar to the gun homicide rate in this country. And they're correlated very sharply. So the conclusions you reach on the subject, they really do depend on what metrics that you use here. And it really, as with so many subjects, it's easy to mislead people if you just selectively pick a metric that's more convenient for your viewpoint and position. Ben Shapiro, he also mentioned mass shootings where, you know, he claimed the evidence is weak, that, you know, more guns, it's not necessarily correlated with more mass shootings. And again, this really does just come down to what metrics you use and how you go about measuring and evaluating this. Paul Reaping et al. In a 2019 study, for example, they found that the more permissive a state's gun laws, the looser their gun laws, the more mass shootings they had per capita. And conversely, the more restrictive a state's gun laws, the harder it was to obtain a gun, the less mass shootings. And I'm just like, is anybody fucking surprised by that? Making it easier to get your hands on a gun makes it easier to fucking use that gun to kill people. I'm just like, wow, this is groundbreaking shit. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to for me, is just looking at the data on gun ownership and then just reaching the conclusion that they cause way more harm than they do good. Like the suicide rates, for example, you find a similar trend to what you saw with the mass shootings, where it's like the less restrictive a state's gun laws, the easier it is to get your hands on a gun, the higher the firearm suicide rates. And again, it's just like, wow, you make it easier for people to get a fucking gun, and more people kill themselves with guns. Dude, there's zero fucking surprise there. How is anybody shocked or scandalized by a finding like this? Can anybody honestly say, like, I did not expect to fucking see that? Making it easier to get a thing that fucking shoots people and kills them, more people shoot and kill themselves with it? What the fuck, dude? Who would have expected it? You know, some states in this country, they make it ridiculously easy to buy a gun. Like, I went to Arkansas a few years ago, and in the fucking grocery stores, they sell firearms. A fucking grocery store. Like, you go there to buy toilet paper and stuff, and there's a section where they just sell guns. It's like, let's see, I got the milk, I got the eggs, fuck, I almost forgot the assault rifles. It's just completely, totally fucking ridiculous to make it this easy to access firearms. And when it's this easy, it's no wonder that the firearm suicide rates are so high in these states. Some Republicans, they'll see data like this and they'll argue, Well, you got to understand that a person who's determined to kill themselves, they will find a way regardless. And the number of suicides, they would be the same because they're just going to find another tool to get the job done. And it's just absolutely not true if you just look at the fucking data on this. And there's been research on this question of suicide effectiveness. And what you find is that if a person uses a gun to try to kill themselves, they have an 85% success rate. If they use any other method of trying to kill themselves, on average, they have a 5% success rate. And what this means is that guns are about 17 times more lethal as a suicide tool than all the other methods of suicide combined and averaged. So it's just totally false to say that the tool is irrelevant and, a person will find a way regardless, because guns statistically are way more lethal and way more effective as a tool for suicide. They also make it very easy for a person to just quickly and impulsively kill themselves in a manner that really no other method can match. You can just pick up a fucking gun and just pull the trigger and then bam, it's done. Like if you take a bunch of pills, for example, to try to kill yourself, you can induce vomiting, you can change your mind, you can call 911, you can get your stomach pumped. There's no getting your stomach pumped equivalent for shooting yourself in the fucking head with a fucking shotgun or a pistol that just blows your head off and blows your brain out of your skull. You can't pull the trigger and then while the bullet's traveling, rethink it and decide like, you know what, maybe I'm going to call the paramedics and change my mind on this. You pull the trigger, it's fucking done. Even if you like slit your wrist or something, you can still slow the bleeding and, try to not bleed out until the ambulance arrives. And, guns as a tool for suicide, they're just uniquely effective and uniquely lethal. And that's why we see the strong correlation. And that's why we see such a high number of gun deaths in this way. What you also find is that guns in the home, if there's a household that, somewhere in the house they just possess a gun, it's much more likely that a person will die of homicide as well. The Giffords Law Center, for example, they write the following in a publication of theirs, quote, "Research published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that living in a home where guns are kept increased an individual's risk of death by homicide by between 40 and 170%. Another study published in the American Journal of Epidemiology similarly found that persons with guns in the home were at greater risk of dying from a homicide in the home than those without guns in the home. This study determined that the presence of guns in the home increased an individual's risk of death by homicide by 90%, end quote. Linda Dahlberg et al. In a 2004 paper, they write the following, quote, "Kellerman et al. Examined the relation between gun ownership and injury outcomes. After they controlled for a number of potentially confounding factors, the presence of a gun in the home was associated with a nearly 5-fold risk of suicide and an almost 3-fold risk of homicide. Other case control studies have also found an increased risk of suicide for those with firearms in the home, with relative risks ranging from 2.1 to 4.4, end quote. Republicans like Shapiro, sometimes they'll cite defensive gun uses in response to these sort of stats, and they'll argue that these take place at such a scale and magnitude that they just outweigh the harm. They'll say you can point to these gun suicides and gun homicides, but if you take into account all the lives that guns save, they vastly outweigh the harm, and they do much more good than they do cause suffering in this country. And it's actually very easy to refute this if you just use a simple, consistent metric to go about just measuring and comparing the different types of gun uses. In this case, we're just going to look at the simple, consistent, easy to measure metric, gun deaths. What you find, we're going to look at 2010 data. Why 2010? Because that's the fucking data that I have on hand right now. Sue me, okay? Other years, you're going to find the same trends. This is just the data that I have available right now. So in 2010, what you saw is that there were 19,392 gun suicides. There were 8,275 criminal gun homicides, 430 accidental gun deaths, and only 230 justifiable defensive gun killings within the United States. And if you take these numbers and you compare them as a ratio, where you look at gun suicides versus gun homicides versus accidental gun deaths versus defensive gun killings, what you find is the ratio there is 84 to 36 to 2 to 1. What that means is a gun, statistically speaking, it's 84 times more likely to be used for suicide, 36 times more likely to be used in a criminal homicide, 2 times more likely to accidentally kill somebody than it is to be used in a justified defensive killing. So anytime Republicans talk about, the good they do, it far outweighs the harm. They're flatly fucking wrong about this. And if you just look at the stats using a consistent metric, you find that they're just massively wrong about this. Statistically speaking, you're about as likely to be killed in a home invasion as you are to die from a lightning strike within the United States. Now, I understand the sentiment behind wanting a powerful tool to be able to defend yourself and defend your family. But I think when you look at all these different stats, it makes absolutely clear that the risks of gun ownership to yourself or to your family, they're way higher than any sort of defensive advantages that these guns confer. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to for me on the subject. It's not that I haven't read the Constitution. It's not that I've never heard of the Second Amendment before. It's not that I haven't read the fucking slogan on your bumper sticker. I just look at the data and I just reach the conclusion that gun ownership, statistically, it causes way more harm than it does good. And it's also clear from the data that gun control, it works. It works to reduce the number of gun deaths. It works to reduce the gun violence. It works to reduce the harm that results from these firearms. And if that's the goal that we have here, then those are the policies that we should support. I'm on Patreon. There's a link in the description if you'd like to support my content. I would really appreciate it. There's also social media links in there if you want to follow me there. I'm trying to build up some of those followings. I would really appreciate it. Make sure to subscribe for more videos if you haven't already. Hit the bell, hit the like button, post a fucking comments. All that fun stuff that's standard on YouTube. You know the fucking drill. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this.